Good evening and welcome to Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre Live. I'm David Neville, and tonight I'll be in conversation with Bernard Farkin, the director of ScotSpace, the space corporation which is based in Prestwick. Bernard was born in Antwerp and grew up in Israel and Sweden. A neuroscientist by training with an MSc from Stirling University on the subject of neuromuscular control and microgravity, he has worked in the aerospace domain for over 30 years. So Bernard, welcome and thanks for being with us tonight. Perhaps I could ask you if you start by explaining what ScotSpace is.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. ScotSpace was set up from the ashes, if you like, of a previous company here at the spaceport, and that's also the reason why I came to Scotland in the first place. Let me just backtrack a little bit and start by saying that for 30 years you mentioned, I have worked for, within, and sometimes in spite of the European Space Agency. The agency was more and more interested in commercial spaceflight. So that is also the background to the title of the talk tonight, which was supposed to be, if I may say so, the second age of space. And at some point it became the second stage of space.
Oh, my apologies.
No, I think it's actually rather good luck that we did this. It's rather serendipitous because, as you may know, all rockets have stages, and the second stage is actually which is the part which brings the whole rocket or the whole payload rather into orbit. So it makes sense that we are now in the second stage of the historical development of space.
Right.
So
Good.
ScotSpace, or the Scottish Space Corporation, has its origin in a previous company here at Prestwick, which worked with the European Space Agency to provide a two-stage to orbit spacecraft. Something you can call a space plane, and that is also why we continued in that direction here at the spaceport. So ScotSpace consists of people coming out of that project. As you may have noticed also in the news the last couple of weeks, there was yet another horizontal launch system which got cancelled where a company went bankrupt. Everybody in the aerospace business spends more time on cancelled projects than actually successful projects. And for me, it's been exactly the same. So I started 30 years ago on a spaceplane project called Hermes. And after 3 years of development, the European Space Agency succeeded in having a specification for a flight qualified nose cone, and then the project was cancelled. At the same time, I was doing a PhD in Scotland on microgravity, as you just mentioned. So in a way, I have closed the circle and I'm now back in Scotland doing microgravity research, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later, and working on space planes and horizontal launch in Scotland. So I feel like I'm coming back to my academic and my work roots here by coming back to Scotland.
So ScotSpace, is it a facilitator of lots of different projects?
Well, let me just say that we have 3 different activities or 3 main branches. One is the European Space Agency project I just mentioned, which is a public-private partnership. It's industry-led. It means that we and our consortium design and develop the systems which are then to be used by the agency. That's a new way of working, where instead of the agencies like NASA, ESA, European Space Agency, and so on, developing the system themselves, they hire or they rent systems after stimulating their development. Just like it is done with SpaceX in the US, Blue Origin, etc. So we worked in the same way, first to develop a space plane of our own, which was then cancelled for all sorts of reasons. And then with the formation of ScotSpace, we worked together with other companies who are building horizontal launch. And again, I will explain a little bit more about that. I will also be able, with the help of Janet, to show a video about exactly how we intend to launch here.
So in Scotland, I don't know about everybody else, but I certainly didn't have a great idea of how much activity was going on in Scotland to do with the space industry. I did read an article at the weekend about things that were happening, but could you maybe give an overview of what's already happening in Scotland and how many people are involved in projects to do with space and space development?
Yes, about 30% of the space activities in the UK take place in Scotland. And Glasgow, for instance, is the city outside the US which has the most manufacturers of satellites in the world.
Really?
Yes.
Gosh, that's amazing.
And the cluster that we're building here is also unique in that we have 2 spaceports and a fully end-to-end supply chain for launching both satellites and eventually humans into space.
When did all this activity start in Scotland, and why Scotland? Is there any particular reason?
Well, the birth of the second stage of space, thank you, David, for the name, is around 2015, when the UK government first organized a competition, which was then changed into a licensing scheme for spaceports. That's really the start of the new space, if you like, industry in Scotland. But before that, we have had a long history of satellite manufacturers working in Glasgow, Cumbernauld, etc. Now around Edinburgh as well. And of course, Edinburgh is the world capital, as they say, of space data. So the data processing, the data dissemination, the data fusion, if you like, taking data from many different sources and putting it together into a picture is all done around Edinburgh as well.
Really?
So when other spaceports talk about having their supply chains over hundreds, sometimes even thousands of kilometers or miles, if you prefer, we can say that we have everything we need within a 30-odd mile radius here. And that includes railway connections, that includes the manufacturers, of course, other transport means, and that includes the port in air, the airport with a Y, which has a direct or will have a direct rail link into the spaceport. So we have the whole infrastructure really on our doorstep here. And just to show you what an ecosystem you have here, and also how bad we are at putting this in front of the public, how bad our public relations work is. At the moment, we have 4,000 people working in Prestwick in the aerospace industry, ranging from British Aerospace all the way down to nano corporations like ourselves. And the spaceport is intended to grow that to 7,000 employees. So it is a unique setup here. The reason why I'm here personally, if I may add a personal note here, is simply that I heard somebody with a Scottish accent when I was working at the European Space Operations Centre. And I started talking to him. I heard about all these wonderful plans. At first, of course, I was a bit skeptical, but then I looked more into it. And I was hooked, and the chance of again working on the space plane made me move to Scotland back in 2015-16, thereabouts.
Right.
And the rest is, I wouldn't say history, but the rest is what you hear today.
So I suppose what would be interesting to know is, if we're not launching satellites at the moment, what is being launched, or what is it that you're trying to launch sooner rather than later?
Okay. you have to make two distinctions or two sets of distinctions. One is between the way, or concentrates on the way you launch. The other is where you launch to. So the way you launch can be either vertical, which is what you've seen from SpaceX, from the Saturn V for Apollo. It's a big rocket which goes up vertically. That's why it's called vertical launch. The other way is horizontal launch, and that can also be in two different ways. That can be with space planes, which are like airplanes, but faster, if you like, to put it very simply. Or it can be like you've seen with Virgin Orbit and the other cancelled project, which uses a Boeing 747 as a launch pad, if you like, the first stage to launch a rocket into orbit. Now, where do you launch to? Well, there are many different places. I'm not going into all of them, but basically you can divide them into suborbital launches and orbital launches. A suborbital launch goes through the atmosphere and does not do a full orbit. It can be used for atmospheric tests, for microgravity research, weightlessness research, which I will tell you more about later, which is what we are doing. And it can also be used, obviously, for other research, like, weapons testing, military research, and so on. Let me just say that we do not do military research. That's by decision in our company, but we work together with the facilities who allow us to work with them, because we have a lot of shared technologies. So you'll hear more about our horizontal launch system here, which is based on an RAF and US Air Force technology. And you'll also hear me talk about the actual suborbital launches, which have been done already in Scotland. And again, people don't know about that because it's military, which is actually just up the coast from here at the kinetic range, which starts basically here all the way up to south of Iceland, where Kinetic and the MOD quite often do tests. And one of them was actually powerful enough to go into orbit, but they did not. They used it as a suborbital test. There was actually a civilian application, I hasten to add. It was not for a weapon system. So you asked about ScotSpace. We have 3 different areas, and I think I will structure, what I talk about around these 3 areas, because that makes a lot of sense for you to understand how the company actually works, but also it does make sense from an infrastructure point of view of how we intend to do space. And of course, I still need to explain why this is the second age or stage of space, but I think we'll come to that as well eventually. So I'll leave it up to you, David, to...
Okay, so tell me about the 3 strands.
Okay, so the first one we have called Responsive Orbital Operations and Transportation Services, or ROOTS, ROOTS. Also because I'm coming back to my roots, that's why I chose the name. But the key word here is responsive. We are part of a consortium of 3 spaceports. The 2 others are the Azores Astroport, the Portuguese project, and Cornwall, so a UK spaceport, the new Key Airport and Spaceport. And the third one is Prestwick. We are also responsible for what is called hosted payloads, i.e. non-satellite launches which are there to do science, basically. That is also our responsibility. And in general, our contribution to the overall project is the assembly, integration, and testing of the payloads of what goes onto the rocket, if you like, the infrastructure as such, the logistics, and very importantly, the human factors engineering. I will talk a little bit more about that later, for the overall system. also in preparation for what we now call human spaceflight, i.e. manned spaceflight, as it used to be called, at Prestwick. So that is Roots. It's an 80-20 partnership, so 80% paid for by the European Space Agency, 20% own contributions, and I'm afraid, or how should I put it? I'm happy to say, but rather pained to say, that it's been more like the other way around. We do 80% of the work for free, basically, for the European Space Agency. That's just the way it is. As you know, we have lost one of our partners, which is Virgin Orbit. We also had three other, or have still, to a certain extent, three other launch providers, i.e. rocket companies, basically, within the project. Two of them are Scottish, Skyrora and Orbex. And the third one is a Ukrainian company called Prime, I think, Prime. As you can imagine, the Ukrainian company has other concerns at the moment. The Azor spaceport works mainly with the European Space Agency for return of an unmanned or robotic spacecraft for microgravity research mainly. And I'm also involved in a project which may go to the Azores as well. And then we have Prestwick. So out of 8 spaceports, out of that competition which I mentioned and the licensing scheme, 6 are in Scotland, 1 is in England, and 1 is in Wales. Okay, so you have Llanbedr in Wales, and you have New Quay in England, in Cornwall. You have one on Shetland, which is called Saxa Vord, where I'll be going very soon. You have the Prestwick one, obviously. You have close to Prestwick, you have another one with which we cooperate, which is the Campbelltown Machianish Air Base originally, which is just across the Firth of Forth here. Sitting here, looking out my living room window, I can actually see 2 spaceports. And I think that outside of Florida, that is actually quite unique in the world. The last one is at Aboyne in Sunderland. So I think I mentioned, oh yes, and there's one in the Western Isles as well, but that is for sounding rockets.
And so that we covered the first strand,
right?
Onto the second strand.
Exactly, we've covered responsive launch, which is our bread and butter at the moment, if you like, or not always the butter, but at least the bread, if you like. The second part is what is actually closer to our, at least my heart, which is going back to the microgravity research that I've done on and off for 30 years. So the idea is to have a dedicated so-called orbital resources and microgravity center here at Prestwick. At the moment, we have 3 partners. So let me just say that on the first one, full disclosure, we are not the lead. That consortium is led by an Italian company called The Orbit. They are the ones who pay for my salary, They are the prime contractor. We are subcontractor to them. The Orbit are known for their space tug, as it's called, which is basically like a tug at sea. It takes a satellite from one orbit to another orbit, and then deorbits it, and that's why they call it the Orbit. On the second strand, which is the Orbital Resources and Microgravity Center, there we are the lead contractor. We are 3 companies. One is, so we partner with 2 other companies, if you like. These 2 companies do the same thing in a way in the supply chain, but in different areas. And what I mean by that is, from the name already, you hear that the first company is called Space Pharma. They work with pharmaceuticals, life science experiments, and biosynthesis, biofilms and biosynthesis in microgravity. But not just in microgravity, also using the temperatures, the temperature gradients, the electromagnetic gradients, and so on, which you have in space, which are resources. That's why we talk about orbital resources as well as microgravity. So they are on the life science side. The second company is it's called Forge 3D. They are experts in 3D printing, so-called additive manufacturing in metals. They're one of the few companies who can actually print large size alloys, which you can't do anywhere else, for space, in space, but also for Earth. So basically, they can build bridge parts, if you like, that way, parts for a bridge, or a railroad or something like that. But their interest is to do this in space for large space structures. Okay, nice. And we, the third partner, if you like, we take the lead. We are there for the infrastructure. We are there for the the scientific part, and we interface them to the universities and so on. And we have this wonderful structure on how it's supposed to work, which we use on a Monday and a Tuesday, and on a Wednesday we do something completely different. But that's at least our intention, how it should work. Okay, so the third area, I'll take out the only public relations item I've ever, which disappears on my screen, I'm afraid.
I think if you hold it in front of you yourself, we'll see it. There we are. Yeah, if you hold it right in front of maybe your chin, we'll see it. There we go.
Yes. Okay. Well, anyway, it's the third part we've called NERV, which is an acronym of sorts, constructed after the pattern of STEM. So you have science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and I would say STEAM. I would add arts to that in education. So we've called it New Space, Education, Research, and Virtual Technologies, which we think are the four important areas which will have the biggest impact on society and on general technological advancement. So a new space, I'll come back to when we talk about the different stages, why I think there's a new space and an old space, a very old space as well, actually. And education, obviously, I think that is a very important part, or an important area for us to get involved in. So everything from from schools up to universities, basically, we will be involved in using our projects as a gateway into mathematics, science, engineering, arts as well, very importantly, literature, science fiction, etc. Research, that goes without saying. And then the virtual technologies, I will need to explain a little bit more, I think. We don't just mean the virtual reality where all, we are awash in nowadays with Meta, etc. We mean it in a much wider sense. So we're talking about everything from extended reality, augmented reality, immersive simulation, to artificial intelligence, but again, not of the type that just very recently has become a hot news item. We're talking about so-called intelligent agents.
Sorry, Darren, what do you mean by intelligent agent?
Yes, an intelligent agent is a set of rules, algorithms, and heuristics. I'll explain in more detail what I mean by that, which can act as a proxy for a human. Okay, so instead of sending a human into space, to Mars, the moon, whatever, you send an intelligent agent to these places.
Right.
We have used them extensively for modeling operations. So how you work in space, we model using intelligent agents. So in a way, it's the opposite of the AI that you hear in the news, because ours is very, very much focused on just the bit that is needed for space exploration. It is not a general AI. The term is artificial general intelligence. It isn't. It is very much artificial specific intelligence we're talking about. And then when you put these two together, the virtual reality and the AI in our way, you actually have a fully immersive system which is interactive. So a couple of years ago, I proposed to the European Space Agency something called virtual human spaceflight, which is something in between human manned spaceflight and robotic spaceflight, with the human firmly on the ground. Okay? That has now become part of the general working of the agency. So, about 10 years after I proposed it, but never mind. It is very important for the way we work, but it's also very important educationally. People can actually directly get involved in the work. People can get a feeling for what it is that gets us to go to space. I mean, yes, many people are there because of the money, but as we often say, the best way to become a millionaire in space is to start out as a billionaire, because it's not all that easy to make a fortune in this business. There are other reasons why we do it, and this is the best way to get people to participate in what we do and get a feeling for why we do it. So that's the idea with NERV. And if anyone here reads and watches Japanese science fiction, that's where the acronym comes from. And I won't say anything more, just Google it, please. You're in for a treat.
Right. Just going back a bit. Microgravity, can you explain what that is?
Yes, actually the colloquial term, weightlessness, is actually more accurate than microgravity, which is a technical term. Because what happens in orbit is not that an object it doesn't lose its mass, but it loses its weight. Okay, very simply, going back to Einstein, that acceleration and gravity are the same thing. When you accelerate an object at the same rate as the rate of gravity, but in the other direction, the object itself does not have weight. So it's actually weightless. So again, I propagate very often for the use of the word weightlessness instead, because that's exactly what it is. Now, we know it from roller coasters or falling lifts or whatever. When objects fall with the same speed, or at the same rate, I should say, they are weightless. So actually, what happens is that you have an object which only experiences gravity and nothing else. So no contact forces. There is no floor to keep you up, so to speak. Okay. So in my early days, I worked with parabolic flights, which use a modified aircraft. In our case, actually a Caravelle. That shows how old I am. We use the Caravelle to provide up to 30 seconds of weightlessness, microgravity, by simply pulling up and then falling down, to put it simply. And in fact, what you have, because it's a parabola, it's a ballistic trajectory, you would have an orbit if we would go fast enough, but we don't, obviously. And so instead of being a closed orbit, it actually intersects the surface of the Earth. Okay, that's why you need to pull up again, and you repeat the cycle. So you do something like 30 parabolas, where you get something like 25 to 30 seconds in the Caravelle of weightlessness, and there you do your work, your research, your sample production, whatever. I've done about 600 of these by now, and it's great fun. Being weightless is great fun. But on the one hand, there are certain things which you can do, but you're also limited by the fact that you have only 25 to 30 seconds. So that's why we are looking to extend that with suborbital launches and obviously orbital, where you can have weightlessness of any duration you like, basically. And also cleanliness. So the cleaner microgravity is, the better. So we are actually not that happy about having humans around, because every time somebody on the space station, for instance, moves, or a cargo bit is moved around, or even somebody flushes the toilet, there are movements of the ISS as a whole, and the microgravity is disturbed. So we're looking at extremely clean microgravity, what we do, and we're looking at long duration microgravity. It's extremely important. Why is it important? Because there are certain processes which you can only do in microgravity. I can give you hundreds of examples, but I'll just mention two here for the sake of brevity. And I know I'm talking too much anyway. On the one hand, it's the pharmaceutical industry, which is looking into new protein crystals, new molecule structures to be used specifically for pharmaceutical development. Okay? The problem, if you have a gravity field, you can't explore all the options, because under the influence of gravity, crystals will not grow in certain cases. Okay? Then you have the opposite. You have places where you do not want crystals. Like in fiber optics, you want the fiber optics to be as clean as possible, because you get degradation in signal. Now, you can't twine, as it's called, fiber optics from an annealed glass, so a molten piece of glass, to a long length without having crystals. Okay, you can't have that fiber optic link or line, if you like, without sedimentation because of gravity. Only in microgravity and in space can you get clean fiber optics. So two examples, one from material science, one from life science, where microgravity is an absolute requirement to be able to produce what you want. And the same goes for metallurgy. It's not just that we want to build big structures in space. We actually want to try out new alloys, which you can't do. Just to give you an example, on the space station, people have been able to produce lead aluminium alloys. You can't do that on the ground because, of course, the lead is much heavier than the aluminium. Now, in space, you get a homogeneous alloy, which has other properties than either lead or aluminium. So that's microgravity. We're also looking into what negative effects microgravity has on the human body. You may have heard things like osteoporosis, like deformations in the optical, in the eyes, basically, and visual acuity changes. There are neurological changes. There is also blood flow shifts. What is normally in your legs shifts upwards. The picture of myself in microgravity, not only am I 30 years younger, but I look even younger than that, because all of the fluid going up to my face making me look even younger. So you can actually see on the faces of astronauts whether they are really in microgravity or not. Okay, Hollywood knows that, actually. So it's very clear that to have a realistic picture of somebody in space, you have to have all those changes, including a stuffed nose, for instance.
So are we going to see people going into space for beauty treatments next?
I didn't catch that. Say again, please.
So are we going to see people going into space for beauty treatments at some point?
Well, now that you mention it, one of the pharmaceutical projects of Space Pharma is actually for cosmetics. So it's an anti-aging serum or whatever. It's not my field, so I'm just telling you what I've read about it. A serum for anti-aging in skin sample, skin tissue. Now, the question is also, what are we doing here in Prestwick? Okay, I think when it comes to microgravity, we have looked at all the options here. we've also looked at parabolic flights again, also in the previous company, with the space plane here as preparation for it. But more importantly, and I think that's going to be your next question perhaps, we have 2 launch providers lined up here at Prestwick. I am working with a couple more, and I can't tell you that many details about those yet. Let me also make a distinction between facility providers like Space Pharma, like Forge 3D. Those are the people who actually build the payloads, the labs in which the samples go. Then you have the platform providers, which are basically the spacecraft providers. And we're working with several companies, including the one I mentioned, which is going to the Azores, or lands at the Azores, which is Thales Alenia Space and the Space Rider and the Rev-1 version of it, which is basically like a small space shuttle. And we're also working with a company called the Exploration Company, who have something very much like the Apollo capsule of the old days, which can take up to 10 tons, basically, dedicated to microgravity and to transport to the space station. So those are the platform providers, and then you have the launch providers. Those are basically the rocket and spaceplane companies. We have one confirmed launch provider who has already launched several satellites into orbit in the US, mainly military satellites, who will be coming, or are already actually in Prestwick full time. They have moved everything here. They will provide horizontal launch, as I explained, using a carrier aircraft, C-17 Globemaster. From next year, launch is planned for September next year, or thereabouts. And we are in a partnership with them, also towards a facility, well, facility in the sense of building in this case, which we are moving into, which then prepares, let's say, our experiments into their rocket, if you like, which is then put into an aircraft, which then launches the rocket from it. And instead of me doing this in interpretive dance and pantomime, may I ask Janet to play the video, and I can drink some tea because I'm starting to lose my voice here.
Okay, great.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So Astreas is our main launch provider, and they work with the Royal Air Force and the US Air Force in leasing. If you could just pause there for a sec. Perfect, that's perfect. Perfect place to pause. So they lease a C-17 Globemaster from the Royal Air Force or the US Air Force, which they have a contract with, which is totally unmodified, unlike what Virgin Orbit was doing, and which we wanted to do previously here. So our payload, and if you look at the square boxes, that would be what ScotSpace would provide them with, is then put into the fairing, which is a nose cone, which is the third stage of the rocket, the upper stage. Okay, okay, if you can roll on, please. Right, as it says there, it's used by the US government for over 40 years. Okay, arguably, but I'll explain what they mean by that. So the rocket, as you can see there, consisting of 2 stages, goes into a transporter, which is then put towards the aircraft, entered into the aircraft, all standard equipment, except for the sled itself, and you'll see the sled in a moment. Everything else is just standard equipment, by the way, proven, has been used for launch. Nothing needs to be modified, nothing needs to be recertified, nothing needs to be developed specifically for launch. We all have it here. Okay, And right, that's actually a Royal Air Force one, more likely US Air Force for the first one, the first launches. Okay, we cruised up to 30,000 feet, and there we have a drogue chute which pulls out the actual vehicle, which then separates from the sled. Okay, the rocket ignites and off it goes. Okay, first stage separation. The main part of the rocket is built by Northrop Grumman. And the reason I'm so happy that it's them and not somebody else is that they are experts in solid rocket fuels, propellants. And I'll come back to why that is so important for us. And that's it. And then you can launch again, whenever you want. So the idea is that you can launch nominally without, in normal cases, once a month, so every 4 weeks. If necessary, as Trace told me, that they can do a turnaround time of 2 weeks. So you could possibly launch twice a month. Okay, that's quite unique in the world, and that's why we are responsive. That's what responsive means. That if there is something that you need to launch, you can just go ahead. I'm not saying that it takes 2 weeks from the beginning of a project to launching it. I'm saying that, if you miss a launch and 2 weeks later you have the next one, or a month later. But the turnaround time for a whole project would be in the order of a couple of months, rather than the years that it takes nowadays. Why am I so happy to see solid rocket boosters or solid rocket propellants? The reason is that those are they're not inert in a chemical sense, but they do not leak and they don't have off-gassing. Any so-called cryogenic, i.e. supercooled propellants, like hydrogen and liquid oxygen, for instance, need to be topped up and always off-gas, especially liquid hydrogen, leaks because of the molecular size of hydrogen. So you can imagine if you put something inside an aircraft which leaks hydrogen, the people on board the aircraft are not going to be very happy, right? You also need quite a lot of safety precautions on the ground just to fuel up. Well, as the way Astraeus work, they just have these cartridges lying around. They are safe, okay, as long as you don't put a fire thrower on them. They are safe to store. And whenever they are needed, they are actually loaded. Instead of the fueling, even with kerosene that you have gas and kerosene that you have on the airport, you have quite a few safety precautions for it. We don't need that, or Astraeus do not need that. It is the safest way of launching. Okay, so just to give you some figures, they can launch up to 800 kilos up to what is called low Earth orbit, where the space station is, for instance. A little bit less to other orbits, and they can launch from anywhere in the world. So even though they start in Prestwick, where they have their base, if you need equatorial launch, for instance, they can launch over the equator. You can launch polar, you can go up to Iceland, which is basically what they will do the most, I think, and launch from there. So it's a very flexible, very well proven system. I think they've done something like 12 or 13 missions already with satellites. And actually there is a video which I could have shown you, I just remembered, which shows an actual launch, which is what you have seen here in the model. So, it has been done. It is a proven technology. Nothing needs to be developed. It just needs to be integrated and certified. So I'm very excited about our cooperation with Astraeus. Let me say just a few words about the second launch provider. I cannot mention the name, but what I can say is that we're talking about a system which is like, does anyone here remember Fireball XL5?
Yes.
It's almost identical to the launch concept of operations that they will be using. The only difference, I actually looked it up, the only difference, and I enjoy Jerry Anderson shows anyway, the only difference I can see is that they will use both the space plane and the sled's engines on full for first takeoff and then launch. So you basically have a sled with a space plane, looks like a big fighter aircraft basically, which then accelerates up to Mach 3 or 4 on the sled, takes off, and then you have a rocket stage ignition, which makes it go into orbit as a whole, and then lands here again at Prestwick or anywhere else as a normal, like the space shuttle did, in a way. It's to be used for 3 different, or actually 4 different missions. One is actually point to point. So they have agreements with Seattle, where they are based, Prestwick, and one in Japan, where they can offer very speedy transport. We're talking about an hour to go around from one end, Seattle, to Japan. Okay, we're talking about those speeds. The second mission is deploying large satellites into orbit, up to 7.5 tons. The third mission is as transport to the space stations which are coming. After the ISS, we will have 3 or 4 commercial space stations. And they will also be able, if the ISS is still up there, which I doubt very much, they're also able to go to the space station, of course, the ISS. And the fourth mission is the one, arguably, which is the most important for us, is to build infrastructure in orbit. So I'm looking at the time. Let me conclude by saying that here we have the example of what new space is and why I think we have the second stage. And with firms like Astreas, we're well on our way to the third age, or David, if you prefer, stage of space. The first age started in 1957, obviously, Sputnik. Can't get away from that. It ended, I would say, maybe if I am very generous, maybe at the end of the space shuttle era, but I would say that it was already in the doldrums before that. It had a little bit of an uptick in the 1986 to 95, the optimistic late 80s and early 90s, where I started my career, and we were very optimistic about all these things. We were talking about the in-orbit infrastructure. That was the big topic at the time. And it all came to naught, really. We got this white elephant. And especially what we have now is the super white elephant, which is Artemis, which is a totally unnecessary, superfluous, risky, wasteful, political kludge of a project. Sorry to be so controversial, but I think that the Artemis program, the lunar program, is a waste of time and money. So let's say that we had then the first age of space, which was politically motivated, militarily motivated, and nothing else. Land a man on the moon. It was really a man. Land a man on the moon. That was the goal. Okay. Later on, the space station. Why? Yeah, well, we want to be able to work with the Russians and with the Europeans. Okay, fine. You can do that building whatever, bridges. It all changed around 2015, I would say. And it's not just because I came to Scotland or thereabouts. There was a new way of doing things. Okay, and the most visible parts, but not the most important ones, is when you see SpaceX, who are much more efficient, much more goal-oriented than NASA, for instance, although stimulated by NASA. And all the other companies like ScotSpace, for instance, who work on the second age, if you like, which is needs-oriented, commercially sustainable, environmentally sustainable, very important, and has long-term goals. Okay, no political goals, no military goals. Mainly, it's not always the case, the last one, but mainly. There is a little bit of a space race going on with China, between China and the US. We don't care, you know. We work with any democratic and open society on earth. I work a lot with Israel, for instance, let me just say that, for all sorts of reasons. But it is especially a commercially and environmentally sustainable, needs-oriented space activity. Now, that's that's where we are now. The third age of space is what we are working towards, and which motivates us to work in the second era already, if you like, which is what we've called the industrialization of space, i.e., certain processes, certain resource extraction processes we should never have done on Earth, because the things we are looking for, the processes that we want to do, are much easier, cheaper, and actually much more environmentally friendly than doing them on Earth. So,
can you give us an example?
Yes. We have a big problem in that, for instance, the laptop or notebook which I have in front of me uses rare earth metals. Everything from niobium to thallium to God, I had a whole list, and yeah, anyway, it's late, but the whole list of rare earth metals, okay, which we need in order for them to work in the chips, in the display, etc. Okay, these rare earth metals. Again, I'm a neuroscientist originally, so please bear with me if I mention the wrong names. These rare earth metals are concentrated in just a few places, mainly in China, where strip mining is a disaster environmentally. We are also talking about now in Japan to do undersea mining of rare earth metals, which is even worse. Okay. Now, anywhere in the solar system, you have these chunks flying around. And I'm not talking about going to the moon for mining. I don't think that's where we should look at. But they actually come to us. There are tons of material in near Earth orbit, which we can use. We already have. Okay, we had a DART mission not long ago, which was used for redirection, but also for resource extraction. So when I say that Scotland is one of the centers for new space, the other big center for new space is Luxembourg. And why do I mention Luxembourg? Luxembourg has concentrated specifically on resource extraction. Okay, so they are looking into what is called in situ resource utilization on the lunar surface. I'm actually invited to a workshop in 10 days' time or something like that, which is a bit embarrassing because I'm not totally convinced that that's the way to go, but I'm going anyway to that workshop. So there is a lot of interest, plans to actually start using space, not as an area or domain for national prestige, but for actually preserving what we have here on Earth by using the resources which are there. What I think is going to be the biggest change is actually solar power, space solar power. And there actually the UK is leading. UK government is spending quite a lot of resources in that area. And one of the leading companies, SolarSpace, is actually from the UK. So within 5 to 10 to 15 years, a large part of our energy needs will come from space as well. So what I tend to say is that space will eventually, in the long term, give us unlimited resources, unlimited energy, and I would say unlimited life for humanity as a whole.
How interesting and fascinating. But let me just ask you about these objects flying in space. Where do they come from?
They are from three different sources. One is they are remnants of the formation of the solar system. So you have the asteroid belt, but that's not all. Yes, the majority are between Mars and Jupiter, but you have so-called near-Earth objects. They come to us, and they are a threat. You had the Chelyabinsk meteorite, for instance, not that long ago. They come to us, they are a threat, but they're also an opportunity. There is a very interesting mission, which ESA is working on, to an asteroid called Psyche, which is a very rare metal, or relatively rare metal asteroid. So basically, on the one hand, you've got asteroids which are more carbon-based, so organic material. You've got silicate-based, so basically rocks, if you like, quartz, to put it simply. And you have metal-based ones. And Psyche is almost completely metal. So there is a mission, I don't remember what year they intend to arrive. It's in a couple of years' time, where they want to look at exactly the composition and how we can retrieve it. And it's actually closer than going to Mars, for instance. So I would say, for instance, that SpaceX is doing the right things for the wrong reason. Okay, it's good that they're building large launch vehicles. However, Elon Musk's ego trip to be buried on Mars is not really a motivation which is in harmony with what the second age of space is all about. And whatever you may think of Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Blue Origin, their focus is really on the long term and on the industrialization of space, as I just mentioned.
I read in the paper is a speculative story about the possibility of going from London to Sydney in 2 hours by space. Is that a possibility?
Well,
Can you see that happening?
Why not from Prestwick?
Well, from anywhere really. I
No,
guess.
but I'm saying that because that's exactly what the plan is. So you have our second launch provider who will go between Seattle, Prestwick, and Japan, and other places. I don't know what other agreements they have, to provide very fast transport. So the initial vehicle has a crew of 5, so 5, let's say, astronauts on board. But eventually it will have a passenger cabin. So basically, yes, you can go, it's even faster than that. You can go from, say, Seattle to Japan, theoretically. You could go in 1.5 to 2 hours, basically, depending on trajectory.
I suppose one of the things is the question of what happens to the body going into space for these short flights. Is that something that we're still experimenting and exploring, and that's the bit that needs to be worked out?
Thank you for mentioning something which is a bit closer to my background. That's exactly why we do horizontal launch. So I'm now working with a company who wants to limit the G-forces on the human body to something like 1.5 to 2, which is basically, it's not that much more than you had on Concorde. So let me be clear, there are 2 big areas where we need technological development, but also physiological experimentation. One is indeed microgravity on the body. The other one is radiation. And technologically, we have the solution for both of these. For microgravity in the long term, we're not talking about a week of microgravity, that's fine. We're talking about years. We have just had an astronaut returning from the space station with SpaceX and the Axiom team, with whom we have also a relationship, by the way. I think she was in space 687 days altogether, so more than 2 years, okay, altogether over her career. She's the longest suffering, if you like, astronaut in America. There are a couple of Russians who had even longer exposure to microgravity. If you're talking about that, you really want artificial gravity. How do you get artificial gravity? Well, we're back to Einstein. By rotation and by acceleration, you get gravity. So think 2001: A Space Odyssey, the big wheel in space, the big space station, which rotates and gives you artificial gravity. Or even the spacecraft later in the movie also rotates. That gives you artificial gravity. We are working on it. And I'm happy to say that the latest experiments that I've seen have shown that it's a lot easier to obtain an acceptable, from a physiological point of view, rotation speed to get 1g, i.e. one gravity, one Earth gravity, than we thought. We are tolerant to rotation more than to microgravity in a way. The second area is, of course, radiation. And I can tell you, I can go on all night about the effects of radiation, but I can also tell you that I'm happy to say that, especially the European Space Agency, has done experiments with something called active radiation protection, which is basically creating an artificial magnetic field, electromagnetic field around the spacecraft, just like on the Earth, which protects you. And in the experiment, inside the protective field, you actually had lower incidence of cosmic rays and particles than on the surface of the Earth on a sunny day. Okay, it is that tight, that artificial radiation protection. So the two big bugbears, if you like, of space exploration, microgravity in the negative sense, and radiation can be solved quite easily.
Well, Bernard, you've given us a fascinating insight into what's happening in space development, not only in the UK, but particularly in Scotland. And you've given us lots of food for thought. And we'll be watching closely and carefully to see what develops in the short term and in the longer term. So thank you very much.
It's my absolute pleasure.